Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 21st Kenneth Nebenzahl Jr. Lectures in the History of Cartography. I'm Jim Ackerman, and I'm the current director of the Smith Center for the History of Cartography, and I'm desperately looking for the beginning of my remarks. Not that I couldn't wing it, but there are a few things and a few people I want to thank. You know it's time to retire when you have to have somebody handle all the... David Buisseret knows what I'm talking about. I used to have to explain DOS to him, but anyway, these are the world's oldest lectures, lecture series dedicated exclusively to map history. They were established in 1966 through the generosity of Ken and Josef Nebenzahl. Josef will be here, I hope, later today. Ken passed away, unfortunately, in January 2020, and this is the first time that we're holding lectures without his presence. And that was just 3 months after Josef and Ken had made an additional donation to the library that will allow us to continue these lectures indefinitely. The series also coincides with the 50th anniversary of the dedication in the fall of 1972 of the Newberry's Herman Dunlap Smith Center for the History of Cartography, the first research center of its kind anywhere in the world. And I am pleased that Adele Smith Simmons, the daughter of our founding benefactor, Herman Dunlap Smith, or Dutch Smith, is also here this morning. She just raised her hand. I won't make her stand. Adele, thank you for your continued support. This series stands apart, in my mind at least, from all that have preceded it in the next Nebenzahl series because of its unusual topic and organization. Though addressing, as in the past, a single theme in map history, these lectures are organized into 4 sessions devoted to sub-themes and consisting of 3 or 4 shorter lectures rather than 6 to 8 longer ones. It is also the first series to be presented simultaneously both to an in-person audience while also live streaming to a worldwide audience. The lectures will be also recorded for the first time and eventually put up on the Smith Center website so that those who could not attend or watch in real time might enjoy them at their leisure, perhaps in their pajamas, a nightcap of fine single malt scotch in hand. That's at least how I plan to watch them after I retire in 1 month. Our topic, mapping as performance, has been chosen deliberately to be provocative, stretching the boundaries of what most people will consider the history of cartography. Although I point out that none other than Abraham Ortelius and his successors equated mapping to theater 450 years ago, so this is not all that new an idea. Consider the terms given equal weight in this title. Mapping is a very broad term, broader than cartography itself. For while cartography is usually defined as a graphic representation of geographic space or the art of science of making maps, for decades, literary scholars have freely referred to geographical descriptions written in prose or verse as mapping. And mapping has dozens of uses, not all of them spatial, in our common speech. Several map scholars, among them Matthew Edney, who is here, have argued that the study of mapping, while embracing the traditional concept of cartography, should go beyond the study of physical maps to the processes by which maps are created, shared, and used. Importantly, this framework recognizes that mapping is an ongoing and broadly human activity. It does not end with the creation of a single graphic representation, but continues through the interpretation of the map and the personal and societal impact of those interpretations. Impacts that may indeed include the making of new maps and new ways of thinking and acting in and about space. This opens the door to thinking about mapping as performance. This is not a new idea, as these title pages show. Ortelius, drawing on 16th century rhetoric, saw an equivalence between mapping and the theater, both the literal staging of a play and the broader notion that was common there of a theater of knowledge, which was also even a physical piece of furniture. Performance, for most of us, most of the time, refers to something we see or hear on a stage or screen, something like this. A work of art or entertainment that unfolds for our enjoyment, appreciation, and contemplation, occurring in a space, either physical or virtual, set aside for the purpose. Performance studies, since its first articulation in the last century, within the academic study of theater and other performative arts, in literary and cultural studies, and anthropology, embraces a far broader definition of performance. It thrives on the comparison between artistic and cultural forms of performance, the latter including routine ways in which we express and conduct ourselves, the rituals we follow from spiritual to the mundane that continuously convey to each other who we are and what we believe. The Oxford Dictionary of Human Geography defines performative mapping as an approach to cartography that understands map making and map use as a performative and embodied. Traditionally, cartographic theory is concentrated on maps produced, accuracy and readability, or technical innovation. Performative mapping recognizes that maps are produced and used through a diverse set of practices: surveying, drafting, digitizing, scaling, generalizing, rolling, folding, marketing, and so on. I endorse this definition of performative cartography. It certainly broadens what we have traditionally meant by mapping, but is still largely concerned with the processes associated with the creation of traditional paper maps. We're going to go beyond that these next day and a half. If we are to be mindful of what performance studies is telling us, we will need to open our eyes to the promise of Ortelius's frontispiece, that there is a little bit of theater and a little bit of mapping in many aspects of the way we interact in the world and with each other. And particularly important over this next day and a half is the notion of embodiment that was mentioned by this definition, which entails, so we're looking at mapping then as something that involves the movement of bodies through space and annotations and other forms of interaction that are coming along. The 4 panels of shorter lectures that will follow in the next day and a half each consider how this is so at some level. We start with a new look at something quite familiar to the world of cartography, the act of surveying. We will follow with a panel examining how mapping, some very old and some quite new, inscribes and presents indigenous identity in geographical, cultural, social, and virtual and digital space. The last session today brings performative dance, embodied mapping, and geographical mapping together. Finally, tomorrow morning's 3 lectures will look at how the act of travel is productive of mapping in various forms. Your applause is welcome after each performance, but the panelists will be responding to your questions only after all of the 3 or 4 acts in each session have concluded. Think of a symphony. Don't clap after the first movement. No, you can clap, just don't ask questions. So Matthew Edney, who we mentioned already, will moderate this first session. He'll be marshaling the questions when they come. He is professor of geography and since 2007, the Osher Professor in the History of Cartography with responsibility for courses in map history at the University of Southern Maine. He is also faculty scholar at the Osher Center, Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education. That's a different Smith. Since 2005, he has also directed the massive History of Cartography project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our very first speaker is Dr. Ernesto Capello. He is a professor of Latin American history at Macalester College in St. Paul, where he has been since 2008. He received his PhD from the University of Texas in 2005 and has served on the faculty of the University of Vermont before coming to Macalester. His scholarship emphasizes transnational imaginaries and encounters, urban history, visual culture, and the history of cartography. These currents intersect in his first book, The City at the Center of the World, Space, History, and Modernity in Quito, at the University of Pittsburgh Press, 2011, which posits 6 narrative challenges, narrative configurations of space-time that provided a framework for Quito residents to navigate the challenges of a city undergoing the dislocation of 19th and early 20th century history, or modernization. He has a long association with the Newberry Library and the Smith Center, twice a participant in Newberry's NEH summer programs in the history of cartography, and after the first one, he collaborated with another participant, Julia Rosenbaum, in the organization of a conference here at the Newberry, which eventually became the book published by Routledge in 2021, Cartographic Expeditions in Visual Culture in 19th Century Americas. And he's going to be speaking with us today about triangulating Shuyu, commemorating and testing French geodesy in the Ecuadorian Andes. Please welcome Ernie Capello.
Good morning. Thanks, Jim, for that introduction. Thank you to the Newberry for inviting me to be part of this really exciting series of Nebenzahl lectures. As many of us, I look forward to the Nebenzahl lectures as a signature event in the history of cartography, and it's a great privilege and honor to be able to not just be here, but to be starting us off for the discussion that we'll have over the next couple days. So I want to begin my talk this morning with a quick reflection on this interplay between mapping and performance, but especially the linkages between surveying and performance, which is the main topic of our panel this morning. As Jim has already established in his earlier remarks, map history is largely focused upon the objects produced by map makers, with attention to the conditions in which they were produced, as well as the uses to which they were put, relegated to a somewhat secondary position. A map, in spite of its centrality as an object, and indeed most frequently as a visual object to be seen, undoubtedly can be considered to be equally an embodied and performative object, or a script for movement through space and time, and as well as a product of encounters and processes that are themselves imbued with a performative spirit, in which the individuals, communities, and other social actors involved gesture in ritualistic or even predefined ways. While maps themselves, used or deployed in embodied manners, thus become performative, the act of surveying, which represents a fundamental component of the building process of the modern map, stands out itself as rather clearly performative, given its engagement with bodies in space, the deploying of props, from sextants to quadrants to theodolites, to measuring instruments, field notebooks, protective gear, etc. But the survey itself also stands as a script for future activities that slowly develop in a manner reminiscent of the time-based process that is the performative. I've been reminded of this over the last several weeks through an encounter that might seem familiar to many of us. In Minnesota, where I live, people are fond of saying that there are only 2 seasons, winter and road work. On Summit Avenue, which I drive down regularly on the way to Macalester, the past couple winters have created a dramatically implausible mess of potholes that severely threatened the suspension of Pierre, our small Mazda 2. But in early September, things became worse for several blocks when a team of surveyors in their yellow vests and with complete disregard for drivers on the road, not to mention the cyclists on the street as well, took their measurements 1 block at a time, disdainfully glancing at us passing by. Slowly, however, over the next several months, the results of the survey transformed the landscape, such that Summit Avenue, or at least half of the drive that we take to school, has become a joyous place to traverse, with little Pierre gleefully gliding along. A survey becomes a script, enacted in this case by the subsequent highway workers of the city of St. Paul, and our commute is transformed just in time for the next season of winter. Next roadwork, perhaps the rest of the commute will be equally transformed. The point of the story, relatively innocuous as it might seem, is both simple but suggestive. Surveying not exists only as a performative act in and of itself, but also establishes a script for subsequent transformations of landscape, whether it be through the kind of roadwork I've been describing, or through the development of urban neighborhoods, the establishment of highways or railroads, or the colonization of vast swaths of land across whole continents. The survey thus operates on multiple temporal and spatial planes, involving an embodied process of measurement along with a time-based transformation of space and the accompanying transformation of social relations, from Pierre's commute to Macalester College, speeding up, to the destitution of indigenous lands, a script of performative transformation. The incident that I'll be reviewing today, a 1902 conflict at the base of Mount Shuyu in the southern Andes of Ecuador, demonstrates the degree to which this kind of relationship between surveying and its transformative power had become ritualized and also contested by the early 20th century. After a brief description of the conflict itself, which is further complicated by the presence of French military geographers who are themselves commemorating an 18th century voyage to the same land of the equatorial Andes, I'll then proceed to unpack the performative associations that surveying had taken on. So first, a very brief account of the incident itself. On January 24th, 1902, a group of Ecuadorian military officers escorting a French geodesic mission attempted to reap a field of barley near the hamlet of Cacha, located at the base of Mount Shuyu in the Andean province of Chimborazo. The field's owner, an elderly indigenous man named Juan Guaman, demanded to be paid for his barley and chased off the soldiers, who returned some hours later, accompanied by French artillery officer Alfred Brasselet. Guaman was joined by his neighbors and kinspeople. In the ensuing confrontation, Brasselet shot into the crowd in an attempt to escape. Guaman was killed, and another man, Miguel Guaypacha, was injured. The incident sparked an international inquiry involving the Ecuadorian state, the Bishop of Riobamba, the French military scientists, and the indigenous community. While each of these actors played their part, and each attempted to assert their lack of culpability, in my talk today I want to stress just how much the core of the conflict lay in Guaman's resistance act to the threat of both expropriation of his alfalfa and of surveying of Mount Shuyu by the French and Ecuadorian military officers. His decision stemmed from a complex intersection of forces coursing through early 20th century Ecuador, including religious, political, and land conflicts, which had become endemic within the Cacha region in the midst of modernization and civil war. In this context, surveying acted as a script and antecedent for a variety of undesired dislocations, which sparked the Resistance Act itself. To begin to unpack these various layers of associations and meanings, however, it's necessary to first introduce just why there was a French military mission in the Cacha region to begin with. Indeed, the French military mission that visited Ecuador between 1901 and 1906 is perhaps most noteworthy for being the second such mission. As is somewhat well known, in the 18th century, a cadre of Enlightenment philosophers led by Charles-Marie de la Condamine measured the arc of the equatorial meridian in what was then known as the Spanish province of Quito in order to answer a scientific dispute regarding the shape of the Earth and incidentally prove the veracity of Newtonian physics. The subsequent notoriety of this mission helped to put Quito's equatorial location literally on the map and would inspire the country's eventual rebranding as the Republic of Ecuador in the 19th century. Despite advances in geodesic technology over the course of the 19th century, however, the original measurements were never updated. Clamors for a new study involving modern heliotropic techniques began to appear at geodesic conventions as early as 1889, in part due to an effort to establish a standard for universal time, especially integral for shipping tables. These calls culminated in an impassioned plea by the American delegation at the 1898 conference in Stuttgart, at which point the French Academy of Sciences decided to outfit a reconnaissance trip to Ecuador in 1899, followed by an official geodesic mission a couple years later. This counted with significant financial and logistical support from the Ecuadorian government, at that time led by the radical liberal General Eloy Alfaro, and also private funds from Prince Roland Bonaparte. The main team arrived in 1901 and would conduct its measurements of the equatorial meridian over the next 5 years. Geodesy is a science dedicated to the measurement of the exact shape of the Earth, and from the 16th to 20th centuries was dominated by a process called geodesic triangulation, in which one used elementary Euclidean geometry to determine the angles and lengths of the Earth's curvature. The first step in any geodesic triangulation was to measure a baseline, essentially a long line in a flat space that could then serve to help determine the lengths of the imaginary chain of triangles, and in the case of Ecuador, the length of the degrees of latitude across the Andean spine. The center of the southern base of operations, just a few miles from Cacha, was the city of Riobamba. Riobamba had symbolic as well as practical significance. It had been the hometown of Pedro Vicente Maldonado, La Condamine's colleague, who drafted the first national map of the territory that would become Ecuador. It is additionally the capital of Chimborazo province, so named due to its proximity to the great volcano that Alexander von Humboldt famously elevated to allegorical significance in the famous tableau from the Geography of Plants from 1805. On the practical side, Riobamba happens to lie on an extended plateau that already had attracted the 18th century scientists because of the facility of developing a baseline from which to extend the triangulations across the southern Andean spine of the country. Despite these advantages, 19th century Chimborazo had also been a hotbed of insurrection. This included scores of indigenous rebellions, of which the largest was Fernando d'Aquilema's 1871 uprising in Yaruquillas, which protested the privatization of indigenous lands and at its height involved more than 10,000 participants. The conservative clerical alliance that dominated the province following d'Aquilema's defeat proved an opposition stronghold during Eloy Alfaro's 1895 liberal revolution, with guerrilla fighters operating as openly as late as 1897. Even Arsenio Andrade, Riobamba's bishop, briefly entered exile rather than submit to the heathen liberals and continued to challenge the state's legitimacy after returning to the city in 1901. These conflicts soon embroiled the French mission, which locals saw as allied to the liberal state. Indeed, it was only through cultivating Bishop Andrade that the mission was able to successfully develop its activities after a spate of thefts of equipment and destruction of geodesic signals threatened to halt its activities in the Riobamba region. As noted by the mission's military officer, future anthropologist Paul Rivet, a local hacendado he refers to as Don Pedro suggested that local populations might be mollified by receiving the blessing of the bishop. With nothing to lose, mission commander René Bourgeois brokered the bishop's participation in a cornerstone ceremony, to which he also invited President Alfaro, who declined, and Chimborazo's liberal governor Julio Mancheno, who accepted. In the elaborate ceremony held in July 1901, both Mancheno and Andrade declaimed extensive speeches in which they claimed the mission's glory for their patrons, the liberal state and God, respectively, while Commander Bourgeois attempted to remain neutral. Andrade's benediction is particularly noteworthy given its extension, its ceremony, and its attempt to claim French science for the church. In particular, he reflected on his recent conflicts with the liberal state, while praising the Catholic faith of the French scientists despite the, quote, oppressive and incredulous scourge of liberalism. These censures introduced his declaration of the mission's divine origin as, quote, work that will give luster to science and give benefits to humanity, and in the end, ground us in our Catholic beliefs. Andrade's ceremonial commitment to the mission did indeed help to minimize continued resistance from the landowning elite. However, it did not completely eradicate the conflicts with indigenous communities as evidenced by the clash in Cacha. This speaks both to the limits of the bishop's reach, but also to the ways in which surveying had taken on meaning of its own within this relatively isolated community. To pursue this analysis, then, I'm going to turn to a more extensive distillation of the conflict of January 24th, 1902. On the afternoon in question, Sublieutenant Francisco Gomez de la Torre of the French mission's Ecuadorian escort, accompanied by two companions, left the mission's camp, the Shuyu Peak near Yaruquillas. And you can see where Shuyu is on the map there, a few kilometers from the encroaching railway. And you can also see the railroad on that map. The trio traveled to a nearby spot named Cacha, where they began to reap the field of fresh barley until challenged by Juan Huaman, as noted earlier. Huaman demanded payment for his crops and appears to have threatened Gomez de la Torre with a large stick. This prompted the lieutenant to return to the base camp, where he notified Captain Lancôme, the ranking officer. Lancôme authorized artillery officer Alfred Brasselet to travel to the area in full military dress in the hopes of intimidating the local population and collecting the grain, which was to be used as food for the group's mules. And there's an image of Brasselet there. It's somewhat unclear what occurred next. According to the military officers, when they returned to the field, they found a multitude of indigenous people whom they claimed had been drinking. Gomez de la Torre offered to pay for the 6 mule loads of barley that had been cut, but was rebuked by the largest man of the group, Miguel Huaypacha. Huaypacha supposedly asked for the sum of 1 Ecuadorian sucre for each load, a figure the lieutenant at first refused, but then agreed to, given the growing tension. Gomez de la Torre then relates that Huaypacha and his fellows assaulted the soldiers with sticks and stones, leading to the confused flight. According to Brasselet, old Juan Huaman tripped him with a 2-meter-long pole, at which point the Frenchman fired twice into the air with his revolver, hoping to scare off his attackers. Since they continued their pursuit, he fired into the crowd and shot both Huaman and Huaypacha, killing the first and wounding the second. Only as a result of this intervention were the 4 soldiers able to escape to their camp, where Captain Lancôme immediately sent them to notify the governor of Chimborazo province, beginning a 7-month-long lawsuit. While both Brasilet and Gómez de la Torre refer to the incident as a revolt in their testimony, a claim that may have been intended to link the conflict with the previous civil disturbances in the region, the subsequent testimony of the indigenous community in a series of depositions taken with the help of a Spanish interpreter in late January and early February dramatically contradicted Brasilet and Gómez de la Torre's account. The wounded man, Miguel Huaypacha, claimed to have been returning from caring for his sheep when he encountered a foreigner he had previously seen harvesting alfalfa nearby, who promptly fired upon him for no reason. Huaypacha noted that the gringo was being followed by between 5 and 6 Indians, who he could not recognize as they were about 20 varas, or 15 to 18 meters away. One of Huaman's neighbors, Jose Manuel Paucar, testified that he heard voices shouting that the gringos had killed someone, and upon investigating found the old man wounded with blood spouting from his throat. Not a single one of the other 20 community members interviewed claimed any knowledge of the uprising described by Brasilet and Gómez de la Torre, though all professed to have learned of Huaman's death and Huaypacha's wounding through the grapevine. One of these, Esteban Pilco, even confirmed a history of local intimidation by stating that a few days earlier, another of the mismos gringos, the same gringos, had harvested 8 mule loads of barley from his fields after threatening him with a pistol. As in Huaman's case, Pilco claimed to have been paid 2 Colombian pesos for his goods instead of the more higher wage of 1 sucre. Given the discrepancy between these accounts, the courts prolonged the trial and expanded the investigation. Subsequent testimony revealed that Brasilet was indeed mauled by sticks and stones by members of the community. Witnesses also confirmed that both Manuel Huaypacha and Juan Huaman had been amongst a series of indigenous actors who had been criticizing the presence of the Frenchmen for several days. Crucially, the issue that Huaypacha and Huaman were most concerned about appears not to have been the ongoing expropriation of crops on their own, but especially the measurements themselves. Local leaders like Huaypacha and Huaman appear to have been concerned that the surveys upon the Shuyu peak would lead to government expropriations of the peak itself, which had long been revered as sacred ground associated with the noble Duchisela family since the 16th century. While this fear may indeed reveal a misunderstanding of the purpose of the geodesic survey, as the French military officers would later claim, it also reveals an association of surveying with land expropriation, and a reminder of the importance that specific landmarks held as repositories of ancestral knowledge, spiritual connection, and political legitimacy. As is well known within broader ethno-historical accounts of the Andes, the expropriation of spaces such as Mount Shuyu would constitute the expropriation of what are sometimes called huacas, i.e. geographic sites imbued with the spirit of a community's ancestors. These are more recently being increasingly termed earth beings, using the terminology of Marisol de la Cadena, whose rights are now being enshrined into Andean constitutional law over the course of the last generation. From the French perspective, this association of geodesic triangulation with expropriation seemed ludicrous, and part of the broader tendency to shun them that they had encountered amongst the intellectual classes of Riobamba, who now seemed to be defending their indigenous neighbors. However, as both indigenous communities and the local elite well knew, the act of surveying was far from neutral, and indeed was intimately involved in the establishment of local power and economic relations. Most dramatically, in the recent past, surveying was bound up with the construction of the railroad between Guayaquil and Quito that had been held to be President Alfaro's signature work, and which had indeed been organized to pass along the base of Shuyu according to the French maps of the region. The establishment of this railway, which the French refer to as to a precise nivellement on their maps, had already involved foreign experts, including railroad surveyors from the US and the UK, along with extensive state expropriation of territory, a fact that the indigenous community would have well known. Moreover, the community had already been involved in a protracted legal battle over the ownership of the same lands, which dated back to 1866. This conflict involved the Convent of the Immaculate Conception in Riobamba, which owned the Tungurahuilla hacienda that bordered on common lands that had been farmed by the community since the colonial era. In an 1890 case, the Conceptionist nuns had successfully sued for ownership of these properties. However, in August 1901, just 5 months before the Shuyu conflict, the local state attorney had sued on the behalf of local residents, to be more precise, sued to return the lands to the community. In the months prior to the French arrival on the scene, this case had been moving through its initial phases and was awaiting an inspection of the very properties that were being surveyed, lending credence to the rumor that circulated upon the French camp on Shuyu, which was imagined as a first step in the expropriation of a broader swath of territory than that involved in the original case. Over the next few months, the Ecuadorian courts passed the case from the provincial court to the Supreme Court, which 7 months later determined that the incident was essentially an unfortunate tragedy set in motion by a series of misunderstood circumstances. The French were allowed to continue to pursue their geodesic survey, Brasileiro was allowed to stay in the country, no charges of assault were levied against the Cacha community, and the Hacienda Tungurahua case was allowed to continue its path through the local courts. Incidentally, it ended in 1904 with a judgment in favor of the Conceptionist convent, the judge arguing that the indigenous individuals did not have adequate standing as it could not prove individual ownership and had not sued as a community. What then can we learn from the Shuyu incident? To recap, the incident involved a scientific mission that had become embroiled in a series of local and national disputes, from land conflicts to religious tensions to railroad construction and political battles. What is most dramatic, however, is the degree to which these various conflicts were being misunderstood and represented through a variety of performative gestures, which ultimately escalated into an armed conflict. Surveying operated in Ecuador as an important element within the establishment of state and elite control, a fact attested to the belief of the Cacha community that the French were readying to expropriate their communal and sacred lands. Similarly, the French decision to send Brasileiro in full regalia attests to the knowledge that both the French and more likely their Ecuadorian counterparts had of the importance of these performative encounters as a means to dissuade direct resistance. The symbolic and active confrontation of state incursions by the indigenous community bears further remarking. On the one hand, this is demonstrated through the brandishing of sticks as a threat of violence from Huaman's initial challenge to Gómez de la Torre through the confrontation that met Brasileiro and his fellows. While the rationale behind this turn towards active from threatened violence was lost upon the French, it is clear that surveying had taken on distinct associations that performed a veritable threat of its own against local control. However, we can also discern a framework of performative solidarity in the initial response by the indigenous members of Cacha, who systematically and uniformly responded in silence and in denial of knowledge of any reason why the confrontation would have occurred. This act of solidarity and defiance itself demonstrates the degree to which Shuyu's surveying may have been viewed universally as an attempt to expropriate and claim the sacred peak. In this manner, silence and defiance represent both an assertion of the importance of the earth being, but also a challenge to the ongoing claiming of indigenous territory by colonial forces, even if those forces be involved ostensibly in scientific geodesic surveying as claimed by the French. While this unified stance of solidarity would eventually crack, at least in part, at least enough to limit the infringement of the indigenous claim on Shuyu and the withdrawal of the French and Ecuadorian military, it stands still as a statement of defiant performance in the face of real encroachment performed by the act of surveying itself, understood by the inhabitants of Cacha to be a script in the manner that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk. I'll leave you today with some words from performance theorist Diane Taylor, speaking of the act of present solidarity as performance, which she defines through the Spanish word presente, meaning present, to be present, which I feel resonates with the actions in Cacha in response to the Shuyu incident. Quote, presente, with and without exclamation marks, depends on context. As much an act, a word, and an attitude, presente can be understood as a war cry in the face of nullification, an act of solidarity as in responding, showing up, and standing with, a commitment to witnessing, a joyous accompaniment, present among, with, and to, walking and talking with others, an ontological and epistemic reflection on presence and subjectivity as process, an ongoing becoming as opposed to a static being, as participatory and relational, founded on mutual recognition, a showing or display before others, a militant attitude, gesture, or declaration of presence. The ethical imperative, as Gayatri Spivak calls it, to stand up to and speak against injustice. Thank you very much.
At age 12, Imre got a rather unusual Christmas present in the 1896 edition of Andreas Hound Atlas, a lithographed and leather-bound beauty in double folio size and 15 pounds of weight. packed with geodata from the heydays of the scientific exploration of the interiors of the continents outside Europe. This atlas, which he still holds as a treasure, sparked a long-standing interest in cartography in general, and especially old maps. Inevitably, he was sold on explorative cartography and knew that he had to study history and geography, finally receiving his PhD in 1995. Not finally in a bad sense, finally at the end of this long journey. Wanderlust then took him to many corners of the globe, and most notably, he spent a cumulative 3 years of research in Africa before settling down for a career in academia. In 2008, he was appointed the Virginia and Jenkins Garrett Endowed Chair in the History of Cartography at the University of Texas at Arlington, where he still is. He is the author of 8 books, co-editor of 8 volumes, and well over 60 scholarly articles, mostly on the cartography of Africa and the Americas since the Enlightenment. Since 2015, he has served as the chair of the ICA, International Cartographic Association Commission on the History of Cartography. And he will be talking about surveys in the sand, performing colonial mapping in Southwestern Africa. Welcome, Imre Demhardt.
Good morning and howdy y'all from a German transplant to Texas. I want to take you as David. I may call him with his new middle name, Jim Ackerman told you, and I will get to service in the sand. You will see on this slide on the left-hand side where the location of what's nowadays Namibia. The time I'm talking about, it was Greater Namakwa land and Herero land. Then Southwest Africa, and as I said, nowadays it is Namibia. And you see on the right-hand side of the period orientation map of German Southwest Africa that traveling was in performance in these days, and the surveyors, as I hope to prove, had their hands full. Of course, I also looked for guidance on performance in mapping. While Jim looked for a British encyclopedia, I looked as a good German in Texas for the Merriam-Webster. And our yardstick can be the online version. Map performance is fulfillment of a request, could be an action, a public presentation, and reaction to stimuli, efficiency of an action, and last but not least, speak a visual language. And I maintain that all of these categories can be proven by the case I'm presenting today. And you will also see for the case I am presenting, it's at the intersection of low, at least initial interest, and of low tech. So we are in a colonial environment where you don't have all the technology, the manpower you would normally have at hand in North America or at Europe at that time. What is the menu? I will first introduce you how Southwestern Africa got onto the map. Then I will make a claim that we have drowsiness because of too good initial surveying, not surveying, but let's call it surveying, and the mapping got halted at a certain stage, and where then is the game changer, I will tell you. And at the core of the presentation will be Germany's place in the sun, so the German colonial empire from the mid-1880s to World War I. And I will tell you, as you can see, off to a late start, what it is to be a surveyor in the sand. I will exemplify it with various cases. I will tell you about the significance of a waterhole, that diamonds are not only a girl's, but also the colonizer's best friend. Then I will even get the US Civil War into Southwestern Africa. Hopefully this will be new and interesting to of you here, and then we'll tell you how everything ended. and I will make then a plea for assistance to keeping up appearance of the cartographic heritage in Namibia. Okay, so how did it get on the map? The Portuguese rounded shortly before 1500 Cape of Good Hope. So this is at the bottom of this map. This is a blow map of 1644, and it shows you the imagination of what is the interior of southwestern Africa 150 years after the discovery. There were only 2 permanent European settlements in the middle of the 17th century, then Sao Paulo de Luanda, Portuguese Angola to the north, and the just founded Dutch East India at the Table Bay, Cape of Good Hope. And everything in between had no permanent European settlement and virtually was not researched. This left then imagination. So you have here Nicolas Sanson, a famous French cartographer of the late 17th century, and he came up with a coastline of southwestern Africa where even Norway would be jealous about. So you see fjords and bays and rivers and you name it. And for the ones of you who are a little bit older, so of the generation baby boomer, you will know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and you have there Slati Bartfas, the creator of coastlines, and his PhD, so to say, was Norway, the coastline of Norway, but he never had seen what Sanson did to southwestern Africa. How it looks, in fact, you can see in the middle photograph, it is a rather dull coastline of desert and of sand, and not for nothing it is called Skeleton Coast. So it is one of the shipwreck richest coastline around the globe. It took then another Frenchman, Rigobert Bonne, in the Age of Enlightenment, when all the fantasies about the interiors were cleared out. So at around 1800, so just a mere 230 years ago, Europeans came clear, we don't know anything about the interior. How did this change? The first real fact-based map on the interior of southwestern Africa, and you have in the middle an orientation map. Every now and then I will bring the orientation map, and with the usually red, on occasion green frame, you can see what portion of southwestern Africa I'm showing. In the 1830s, the newly found Royal Geographical Society dispatched Captain Alexander, and he went up from Cape Town to the interior of southwestern Africa and produced the map on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see another map by Thomas Baines and John Chapman, and these are prime examples of the typical surveying results in the mid-19th century. These are route maps. So basically, you are traveling along, you are either counting how many meters or yards or miles or whatever your unit is, you are traveling north, south, east, west. You have a compass. Each time you turn, you make a note in a route book, and the poor cartographer at home had to work from your field notes. And these are the typical maps this resulted. So this is typical cartography in an African environment in the 19th century. I made much of my career in researching Augustus Petermann, and you see this very focused-looking gentleman on the top right, and he got material from polymath Francis Galton, who also made a visit to southwestern Africa. Basically, it is a route map, so he traveled here along, and he made the first trip to the northern part of what is nowadays Namibia, but it doesn't have the feel of a route map. There the performance or the imagination of an innovative map maker comes in, so that you say, okay, if you travel through a savanna, not by features what I map out, but by the coloring of the sheet. So whether it's brown for the more arid, for the more dry portions, if it's green for the more rain receiving parts of Africa. So the map has the feel as if it's covering an area, but again, it is a route map which is concealing that it's a route map. I wouldn't say fake, but it is, let's say, creative, put it this way. Okay, the same Mr. Peterman, 20 years later, was lucky enough to get then a lot of route maps, because this is a good of route maps. You see basically the same area, and here you can see that we have 11 travelers, 8 of them missionaries. You might ask, why are missionaries important for map making? Missionaries, specifically when they are the first in the area, are seen as trailblazers. So they are just the first to open the door for other missionaries to come behind them, after them, and for them it's important to know what the area looks like. So missionaries are a widely overlooked resource on outside Europe cartography in the 19th century. So he based on a crisscross of route maps this map. By 1878, Namibia, or Southwest Africa, as it was then known, was basically in the main features known. There was no mountains, there was no Great Lake still to be found, so superficially the area was known. And a little later, the colonial era sets in, and about this I will talk here. Germany acquired in 1848 Ankara Pequena here. Within a couple of years, acquired this territory and tried to push northwards and eastward, and finally in 1890 settling with the United Kingdom and with Portugal the colonial boundaries. However, public administrations are always, and I repeat always, cash-strapped. You see here on this picture, there are 8 individuals on these pictures, and it shows the complete, I repeat, complete colonial administration, and 5 of these 8 people are missionaries. So if you had good calculus in school, you know the complete administration consisted of 3 individuals. You can imagine mapping was not something what they could do, and the gentleman in the white trouser is the German governor with the name Göring. Okay, you might remember another Göring. His son later became the infamous air field marshal or air marshal, and second in command to Adolf Hitler. So this is not the bad, this is, yeah, whether you can call a colonialist good, I leave it up to you, but this is a different Göring. And 2 governors on, you had Mr. Leutwein. Basically, he had a colonial administration of 150, 100 of them soldiers, and tried to keep order in an area by the size of Indiana and of Illinois. It's pretty clear that you have to be on good terms with the locals, so you can't force it against their wills. So basically, what was the aim of the German settlers? Getting a homestead and breeding cattle for export purposes. Introducing you then to the map. So basically, the 1878 map was a good background. And one of the governors, so the second governor, Kurt von François, with a background of an African explorer, he was placed at the helm of the administration, and he misunderstood what he should do, and he was, for all his 4 years, he was governor, traveling around and making maps. We as map historians love them. You see 2 examples, and they still are route maps. So basically where he traveled, you have information, but nothing to the left and to the right. So it's not really an improvement. The first case that we had a real improvement is, where is Rietfontein? To the left or to the right of the meridian? Here, this is treaty by treaty how the Germans acquired Southwest Africa, today Namibia, and in the border area with South Africa, a British colony, there was a tribe, a very influential tribe, with the name Wielander Basta. This is not that I don't want to, this is how today they call themselves. So there is no need for me to be more politically correct than the locals themselves. Mr. Francois, he placed here one of these flagpoles and claiming them for Germany. And the British claimed it, of course, for the Cape Colony. And in the end, what had you to do? A boundary commission was sent out. On the left-hand side, you can see the German map of 1892, Rietfontein clearly to the west of the boundary meridian. And in 1904, you see Rietfontein clearly to the west. And by the way, this is how Rietfontein looks. Imagine in nowadays dollars spending $126 million in finding out that a waterhole in the middle of nowhere where approximately 80 people sustained, okay, is it now on your side of the boundary or is it at the other side? Also a form of a performance, I say. Okay, so the poor surveyors, for example, for the boundary, what I have shown you. There is, in 2010, the Scientific Society of Swakopmund published a book, the memoir of a land surveyor, Hugo Voss, and you can see how it actually was in a colonial environment. First of all, Namibia has no real harbor, so you have to be placed out in a small boat, and the poor surveyor saw 3 times water, 2 times on the way out and 1 time when he came back home 4 years later. This is how you traveled overland. You had an ox wagon in front of you or you traveled on an ox wagon with 24 oxen pulling the heavy cart. And he had his wife and his children along with them. And of course, there was a huge detail of locals helping him, in this case, providing him shadow while doing the survey. So all the maps I'm showing you further on have this background. And what was the purpose of surveying? Why all the effort? Germans were flocking as settlers in, and in exchange for gunpowder, for weapons, for liquor, for linen, for all the goods the locals wanted. In return, they got land, and this land need to be measured and cadastral information that they had a legal right to it. You can see in green the farms by the year 1912, so all the good farmland was taken up, and of course this saw a reaction by the locals. They were, nomads, so they had cattle themselves, and if all the good grazing ground is taken up by colonialists, then obviously you are losing out. Okay, so either you give in, work on the farms, or you have military resistance. And this is exactly what happened in January 1904. Many farms were burned down, settlers killed. You can see in the center picture a barricade out of biscuit boxes to defend the area. And one of my all-time favorites of colonial photography, this is the defense of a farm. And see the gentleman in yellow standing there. This gives me a clear indication that it is a staged picture 1 or 2 days after the successful defense of the farm, because this gentleman stands there with a long pipe, and if you are in the middle of an attack of about 200 herero, you don't stand up as a visible target and smoke your pipe. However, but this gives you, it's also a form of performance. Okay, what was the result? Germany sent now out at the peak 8,000 troops as expeditionary force, and of course they won in the end. However, at a great cost. You can see it here. The challenge is, where is the enemy? How does the battlefields look like? And where do we get water? Imagine there is no age of television. You haven't seen any pictures. You haven't heard anything about the area, and you are suddenly sent there. It's even worse than sending US troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq without proper maps. But it goes in the same direction. What is the game changer in 1908? You can still see the ox wagon, just like surveyors would travel, and it was clear first, we need an emergency map. And the emergency map is the Kriegskarte von Deutsch-Südwestafrika at the bottom. It is an 8-sheet map. It is the only map series of German Southwest Africa finished during German time. All the others were incomplete by the end of the German period. And whoever here in the room ever served knows that a 1 to 800,000 map might be good for the generals to plan a war, but if you are in a tactical situation on the ground, it doesn't help you. But at least this was the best map compiled within only 7 weeks. And in an age without computer, doing this for an 8-sheet map, this is excellent. Okay, so it came to the decision, we need a railway for better communication, for better transportation. And while building the railway, you had the game changer, because this gentleman, an overseer of the building, of the laying of the track, one of his local workers brought him a clippy, and this led then to a change in the colonial dynamics, in the money flow, because now, in the year 1907, or from the year 1907 to the year 1909, the colonial budget grew by 112 times. So from zero, bankrupt, to having enough money to do everything what you want, including maps, is by finding diamonds. This is the diamond area along the coastline, so it isn't desert. You can see here, these are water barrels, and you have to haul over a distance of 50, 60, 80, 100 miles water in these barrels. Initially, you could get on your knees and to pick up the diamonds. Okay, later you had more sophisticated extraction methods. And of course, you needed surveyors to get here to something what looks like the Klondike. So initially, all the claims were round, and of course, somebody needed to survey them. Remember Mr. Lange from earlier. And this resulted in the first real, we would say real precise map in 1913, the 10-sheet map, Karte des Sperrgebietes, or of the restricted area, which contains not form lines, but real isohypses, so contour lines which were really measured. Now for an American murder at Ancra Pequena. I promised you to get to this story, how America got in. I don't have to tell you about the Confederacy and of the Unions, and the Confederacy had the ship Alabama, which was taking prizes in the Atlantic Ocean and also got them to the Southwestern or to South Africa, and they wanted to sell the prizes to the British. However, they couldn't do so in Cape Town, so they resorted to come to Ancra Pequena, then not in colonial area, and we see here a map by one of the shipmates from the American ship, and you can see there is already in pre-colonial time a signal station, you have a coal deposit, and the USS Vanderbilt, you can see here, coming too late, but being so frustrated that they take the South African bark Saxon, kill one, and bring the ship to New York, and in the end, nothing comes out of it. So you have a murder by an American Union ship in Ancra Pequena. The grave you can still see, and it is the only action of the American Civil War fought out, not exactly on the ground, but at the shore of Africa. Okay, coming then to the final slides. showing you the rapid progress, technology, money, and the influx of trained people. All this was possible after the uprising of the Herero was crashed, after the diamonds were found. So from the year 1907, 1908 onwards, you have a rapid transformation of the map of Southwestern Africa. You see the 1 to 400,000 medium scale map. On the left-hand side, you see the rugged area of the Kaoko, and just only 5 years later, a private investment company came up with this map of the Kaoko, and you can see it has all the water features, all the water places. It tells you where there are elephants, where there are zebras, rhinos, so what you can hunt, and of course, where there is gold, iron, copper, and everything else what is important. Just 5 years between these two maps. Or even within the official map series, you see on the left-hand side, 1908, 3 years later, much more filling and a much better terrain representation. And all this was cut short in 1914-15, because 1914-15 or 1914, the First World War broke out. South Africa sided with the colonial motherland, the United Kingdom. Also, Africa was declared neutral. Okay, we won't get into the story. So they invaded Namibia, and Germany could hold out for a couple of months, but ultimately General Botha, whom you can see here striking out the German. So to the last story I want to show you. It is how to hide a mountain in plain sight. It is possible. The highest mountain in southwestern Africa was overlooked for 30 years. So you have the real situation, you have here the coastline, you have here the Brandberg, our hero, and these are the omatacos, or buttocks. This is the sanitized version, so if I would literally translate it, okay. You got what I wanted to say, and it's pretty clear why it's called the buttocks. This was considered for more than 100 years the highest elevation in the land. And our hero got on the Petermann map, okay, you can see it as a mountain, somewhat prominent. Later on the official map of 1908, it looks like that. And in reality, we have it here, and my hero here is Reinhard Mark. He was part of the military force trying to defend German Southwest Africa against the British, was taken prisoner of war, and he escaped. Normally you would think the story ends here. If you escape military imprisonment, then you try to fly under the radar. Normal people would do, but not a surveyor. So he gave himself the marching order, I am doing a private reconnaissance of that mountain. So 2 rainy seasons with 2 cameras, tourist cameras, latched to each other, did a survey and produced this very last ever map done of any part of the German colonial empire. And literally 1 minute before midnight, they realized with 2,573 meters, it is the highest elevation in the land. And here you can see, because there was not a perfect overlap of this makeshift stereo photogrammetry, there were some gaps. And what he completely overlooked is what tourists nowadays are getting into this desolate part of Namibia. It is rock art, the so-called White Lady of the Brandberg. The Brandberg is nowadays known to anthropologists as one of the prime destinations for pre-colonial rock art anywhere in the world. Okay, and I'm ending here with a cautionary tale. Many of the maps are in the National Archives in Namibia, and this is what's happening over there. So you have not only in Namibia, but in many colonial and formerly colonial environments in Africa, in Asia. The same might be true even for Latin America, that it's in a precarious state, and we should strive to get it at least digitized. So if the real thing is not surviving, then at least a digital image. And with this, I thank for your attention.
And I also just want to acknowledge that Josef Nebenzahl has entered the room. And if you raise your hand, Josef, you don't have to stand up. She is the widow of the late Ken Nebenzahl and co-founder of these series. So our final speakers are Clinton Terry and Dan Patterson. Originally from Ohio and a longtime friend and colleague of his co-author Dan Patterson, Clinton Terry serves as professor of history and liberal studies at Mercer University in Georgia. Dr. Terry received his MA and PhD from the University of Cincinnati. He studies the long 19th century in America from the end of the French and Indian War to the beginning of the Great War, concentrating on the social history of technology and economic transformation of the market revolution. Dan Patterson is an internationally recognized author and award-winning photographer. He was awarded the Combs Award presented by the National Aviation Hall of Fame to honor his contribution to the preservation of America's air and space heritage. If you go to his website, you'll see a lot about that. Dan's work has appeared in over 40 books, including five-part series Aviation Century, which he completed in 2007 with Air Vice Marshal Ron Dick of the RAF. He also co-authored American Eagles, A History of the United States Air Force, and many other aviation titles. And some of his photographs are in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery in London. He lives in Dayton. But they're here because I discovered their collaborative book about 9 months ago, Surveying in America, The Point of Beginning, which is published by the University of Cincinnati Press in June 2020, which, among other things, traces the footsteps of none other than George Washington as a surveyor. And this caught my eye by a stroke of fortune. I'm delighted to have them here. Please welcome Clint Terry and Dan Patterson.
Welcome, everyone. Our presentation is built on our book, Surveying in Early America, The Point of Beginning, in which we use reenactment and photography of reenactors in the field as a primary source, recreate what surveyors actually did in the development of the profession of surveying over the course of the 18th century. We did not begin with the idea of performance, but as soon as Jim invited us, performance was obviously at the center of everything that we did. For those of you who are a little weak yet on performance theory, it's simply the idea that what is done is and how it is done are both important. How actors performing what they do actually ties to the final product. And while we did not consider this as we were designing the project, it became very, very obvious that it was an important part of it as we considered making this presentation. And so in the process of doing this, we ended up looking at a variety of performances. Okay, first of all, the actual scene, the stage, if you will, where the actors 250 years ago actually went through the performance of surveying so as to make maps, to create records of measurable and taxable property. Beyond that, we go to the historical actors themselves and an understanding of what they actually did in the field and how they did it. It's not just a matter of, we ended up with a set of taxable property. How that came about, how that ultimately shifted over time, how we got from property as meets and bounds to the rectangular survey grid that those of us who live in the Northwest Territory know so very, very well. Okay, and so this is part of it. The third level of performance, our reenactors, and their dedication to recreating what was done in the field to the smallest detail. Using the unit manual of the Department of the Geographer, George Washington's Mapping Corps during the American Revolution, and following this manual to the nth degree, literally to the point of what they took in the field with them, that everyone shaved 3 days, okay? You had to shave every third day. It's in the manual, and everybody did it. Okay, and so this is part of what the reenactors do. And then, of course, we have our photographer, Dan Patterson, who literally had them survey as it would have been surveyed in the 18th century, and simply photograph them in the process of doing those things. And so we have the performance not only of the reenactors, we have the performance of the photographer, and ultimately the performance of the historian who's trying to frame this in some sort of context that the rest of us will understand. And so in writing and producing the book, we make an attempt to synthesize the images of what must have been to words on paper and image on paper. And so in the process, our subject experts are not necessarily historians. Okay, they are reenactors. They are actors trying to recreate. The question, does history have to look old? Was it done, originally performed in color? Okay. And in the process of doing this book, we took the attitude, no, it does not have to be words on paper, that it can be recreated in terms of image in living color using 21st century technologies to create a more understandable historical account of what the surveyors did in the field.
Thanks, Clint, and thank you, Jim, for having us, and everybody here. My role in this project was to make history come to life. My goal as a photographer, and knowing how the book would be assembled, was to sort of look at this in a cinematic way, to begin with a wide view and then focus closer and closer to what was being done. So before we started, my instructions to the living historians was to perform the survey as it had been done 250 years ago. I will follow you. I may ask you to repeat an action for another angle or another way of looking at what you're doing, but the idea was that the camera is the observer of these actions. We're also very careful to make these photographs where it happened, in the 7 ranges in eastern Ohio. In the very early parts of the survey of this nation, Ohio, as we will discuss in a little bit, was the testing ground for the grid and how all this came to be. So the photographs are, and we worked with a group called the Department of the Geographer, and they are, as Clint said, adamant about being accurate. So before we start, or before they perform a survey at a historical site, the director of the unit collects up everybody's cell phones, all their cameras, their watches, mechanical pencils. There is nothing left of the 21st century. They also handmade these uniforms, which, as Clint and I were talking yesterday, were far cleaner than they would have been 250 years ago, especially since we shot these photographs when it was about 90 degrees in Ohio, and they were in wool. So, what struck me as I was making the photographs is the color of the uniforms isolated the actions of what they were doing. And photographers, if any of you know photographers, are always looking for an easier way to do our job. Well, those uniforms made this much more pleasurable because I didn't have to go look for them. I just had to look for red, white, and blue in the wilderness, and there they were. But they ignored me, which is what I wanted. They ignored me unless I asked them to recreate an action. There were 3 separate photographic sessions. This one is at the gentleman on the right is a guy named Paul Brennan, who is a retired county surveyor from New York State. And his home is in, which you'll see in a minute, in Jerusalem, Ohio, which is in the 7 ranges. And he has built a colonial home and a colonial barn, and he lives a lot in the era of 250 years ago. And so working in his backyard, this is his backyard, which is the wilderness of the 7 ranges. Tony Holmesworth is the director and the boss of the Department of the Geographer and directs the absolute adherence to the manual from the military manual from 250 years ago. They are dedicated living historians who live the era which they're interpreting as their subject. And so our question that we posed for this presentation in our book, does history have to look old? It does not. History happened in living color. The cameras were black and white, the film was black and white, but history happened in living color. We also, just to interject, we had the wonderful cooperation of Colonial Williamsburg, who provided us some of these documents, including this original site survey by George Washington when he was a teenager. And Colonial Williamsburg provided us these images and these maps, and that really solidified our belief that George Washington was always looking over our shoulder as we produced this project.
So why the importance of surveying? Ultimately, it's about capitalism and the importance of land as property. Okay? We tend to take this for granted. What do you own? How do you own it? How does the government protect you? Okay, all of this is central to having every square inch of the United States mapped. Every square inch is designated as someone's property, even if it's the property of the United States of America. Okay, all of this, all that which is even wilderness today, and this is Pennsylvania, it still belongs to somebody, and it's recorded as such. And we have a tendency to take this for granted. Now, there's no absolute reason why it turned out exactly as it did. There were choices made along the way, and those choices have, of course, consequences that go with them, beginning, of course, with the concept of metes and bounds. If you are familiar with it, is basically you measure a parcel of land based on natural features. The top of the ridge, a stream, a large tree in the corner, a rock formation. Okay, all of these things, and you measure the boundaries of this. Okay, and this benefits a certain type of land speculator, or simply one who wishes to acquire land. Or we can do what we ultimately did, particularly west of Ohio, is create an extensive grid system. And that originally you got whatever came with the parcel that you happened to purchase. You needed to go to the land and visit the land and understand that, oh, this particular parcel might be just wonderful, and the next one over could be a hillside like this. Okay, and so every part of it, and the government is going to benefit from this by the sale of this land, and then ultimately benefit from the taxation of this land. And for the speculator, of whom George Washington was one, often preferred the metes and bounds system. Okay, because metes and bounds allowed them to take, in this case, for example, the bottom land and ignore the hillside. Okay, but if he's purchasing land on the grid system, he gets the hillside, the bottom, and whatever else might happen to be there. And so this is an important part of what they were doing, their performance, and ultimately how it worked itself out in the end.
When we first started talking about this project, which was a long time ago, like 18 years ago, And then the idea that Washington would be our collaborator was a pretty interesting idea. So over those 18 years as a photographer, you go someplace and think, well, I got to go by Fort Necessity. I'll go there and take some photographs. We might be able to use them, which is what happened. The importance of Fort Necessity in the contribution of George Washington to our project is he was a very young, new colonel in the Colonial British Army and decided to, and he was sent there to negotiate with the French, which didn't work out so well. And it is where he experienced his only military surrender. Part of that was because he did not have any maps that really defined the terrain. And so Fort Necessity, which is now a national monument, and Washington went back there after the Revolution and laid out where the fort had been. And in our 21st century knowledge of military history, the last place you'd put a fort is at the bottom of a hill in a meadow, where everybody else can ride down on top of you, which is what happened. So Washington learned his craft in Western Virginia. In the 1700s, as the document from Williamsburg showed, he was a teenager. Learned his craft working for the Fairfax company. Fairfax? Yeah, the Fairfax family in near Arlington. So our collaborator, Paul Brennan, happens to live in Jerusalem, Ohio, which is in the Seven Ranges. And that's where we began this process of illustrating what we're doing. And Jerusalem, Ohio is a tiny little town, and it is not in the middle of nowhere, but nowhere is around the corner. And one thing that Paul told us when we first met him is the action of the surveyor is you got to start somewhere. And it's a subjective decision by the surveyor. And then he said, you start somewhere and you determine the point of beginning. And the surveyor's work, point of beginning, is where wilderness became taxable property. And he did really, literally, he raised his hand up and says, we got to start somewhere, and off they went. So in the way of how I directed these guys was to go do your work and I will follow you. And so as this series of photographs happened, in the back of my mind was the movie Field of Dreams. And the voice of Darth Vader saying, build it and they will come. And they just disappeared, and instead of the cornfield, they disappeared into the woods. And an interesting thing that Paul Brennan told us with his assistant is, you're going to likely need a musket. And Paul Brennan had his beautiful replica Brown Bess musket, and he leaned it on the tree with his powder horn and his bag of cartridges. And then we discussed, why will you need a musket? There's wild animals. Native American nations who saw the surveyors as the vanguard for following white settlers invading their lands. The need to hunt and forage for food or military actions. Our first presenter made the point of surveyors in the middle of the road in Minnesota, and they were annoying in their yellow vests, but Pierre soon found out months later the surveyors brought smooth roads and no potholes. So it's a similar, the surveyors often will mean good things are coming. The Native Americans didn't see that as good things, but as this nation grew, the surveyors were often leading the charge. And we're going to discuss a little bit the tools that they used, and Clint is the historian, and I'm the photographer, so he can explain these things better than I can.
Surveying, of course, at its most basic, is the measurement of distance and direction. Okay? It's simple enough that you can literally step it off. 3, 6, 9, 12. Okay? 3. You can stay up at night and put a line out to the North Star. Okay? And with that, you can do a very, very basic survey of a plot of land that you would like to acquire or perhaps document. And it is that simple. But as you can see, the equipment gets significantly more complicated. Now, over the course of the 18th century, the equipment is developed, invented, perfected, so much so that by 1800 till about 1970, the technology of the profession of surveying changes very little. Okay? The measuring devices, the theodolite,
We'll get there in a second.
okay?
Well, let me speak to this real quick.
Sure.
So again, Paul Brennan, who's in the photograph here, is putting a stake in the ground, and that is the point of beginning. And from where they measure, they establish north, either with the North Star or with their compasses, and they sight the sun, but they establish a place to start. It's all yours.
This is perhaps the most important tool of these early surveyors. This is a device known as Gunter's chain. It is a chain of 100 links, 66 feet long. That means that each link is 7.92 inches long. Okay? Seems like a strange distance, but at 66 feet long for the entire chain, 10 chains is 1/8 of a mile, precisely. 80 chains is 1 mile. And when you're looking at trying to measure under the English system of land measurement, distance in feet, yards, and ultimately fractions of a mile and a mile, the length of the Gunter's chain makes perfect sense. It's easier to work with longer distances, and it became the standard. The English system is very much tied to, well, feet, a hand, a foot, a yard, okay? The 7.92 length of the link of a chain corresponds very closely, tip of the finger to the heel of the hand, okay? Very much, very, very closely done to that. With this comes the importance of mathematics, the development of trigonometry, the ability to know, for example, if you know one side of a triangle and both or two of the angles of a triangle, you can, through mathematical calculation, do all of that, okay, through trigonometry. And so much of this performance is done at night or in days of inclement weather, where the And the point of beginning here is important because how you take your calculations means you don't have to walk so far. Okay, you can actually do it's all longhand calculation, but that which makes it both easier and more accurate.
You're going to get the abbreviated version of this talk now. Jim's told us we have to hurry up, so I want to just carry through this. We found with our living historians that tooling existed in the 1700s so that each link of the chain was exactly the same. And so we worked with Paul and his assistant in the woods, in the wilderness where this happened 250 years ago. They used compasses and theodolites. They used the plane table. Many of these instruments are original to the era, which they still use, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. So I'm going to whiz through here. One thing we found, Paul Brennan here at his workshop, is that he built his own instruments, but they work the same as the brass instruments. And the point of this photograph, which is important to the performance, is when the surveyor decides the point of the beginning and puts that dot on the paper, and you can hear the pencil rubbing on the paper, that's where the whole thing starts. And the survey and the maps all come from the point of beginning. And from there, they turn the wilderness into grids, into maps. So these are really an illustration of how the chain is stretched, and the measures are made in the woods. They use red and white poles and flags to make the point. And we also discovered, this is really cool, that the surveyor's field notes are the only permanent record of the surveys made in the field. So the records that are being lost in Namibia and on records around the country, Williamsburg's got a whole cabinet full of field notes from the colonial surveys, and those are the real pencil on paper moment. They go back to their tent or to their office in the evening and transfer the field notes into the charts and the maps, which created the grid that measured America. The Department of the Geographer was formed by George Washington when he became commanding general because he needed professional surveyors to map where they were going to fight the war. His lesson from Fort Necessity was, didn't have the maps. He had the maps, and he had the people answerable to him to create the maps of the Revolution and further. And actually, West Point came from this idea. The School of Engineering at West Point is a direct result of these units. And I'm whizzing through these, but our book is in the bookstore right here. And we'd be happy to sign them for you. And we're very proud of our book. But the point Clint made, I want to make this now. When we discovered the length of the chain was 7.92 something, it is the span of a man's hand. And if you think about that, this country was measured by that dimension, the span of a hand. 7.92 inches times a bazillion is the map from Ohio to California. And so, Jim, can we have like 3 more minutes? Yes. Okay, we're gonna whiz through here. At Colonial Williamsburg, they produced for us a hand-colored survey done in West Virginia, which included Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the Kanawha enters the Ohio River. Well, on one of my excursions, I went to Point Pleasant and photographed the exact same place. And where that watercolor, hand-colored map at Williamsburg and where Point Pleasant, I could find exactly the same point. I was able to walk in the footsteps of these pioneers who mapped America. So I am really going to blast through this. But, you know, it's sort of cinematic, which is what I wanted. But this is how the country was recorded. It's incredibly important. And these men, and They weren't all men. The Army were men, but professional surveyors, they had wives, they had kids, they needed people to pull the chains out, and so everybody was involved in this. And that's an important point to make. America was expanded by families in addition to the military. So this is a point about the equipment, which is handmade or brass, were identical in function. I'm going really fast, sorry. We found at the Greene County Historical Society a survey that had been done for George Washington, plot number 590, and we went to the county archives of Greene County, Ohio, and they had the records for this document that was more than 200 years old. So we took that map and we placed it on an 1865 map of Ohio, and we placed it on a Google map, and I went out with a friend of mine with a drone, and that curved road in the center of the photograph is the same road that was in that plot in the late 1700s, surveyed for Washington. Right?
Ohio became the proving ground. There are 15 different measuring systems for land in Ohio. Everything from the Virginia Military District, which is meets and bounds, and a variety of different grids, only some of which get extended into Indiana, Illinois, and further west. But Ohio becomes the proving ground. And ultimately, they decide on the rectangular survey grid, which most of the rest of the country is connected to. And one of the things to wrap this up, we need to talk just a tiny bit more about the importance of George Washington. When we came to this project, we didn't see Washington as particularly important. Turns out he was. Okay, he starts out as seeing it as a way to a profession and a way toward land speculation. But he quickly sees the military value. He sees the value of it as a plantation owner and land speculator, and the importance of it in fighting the British in the Revolution. And ultimately, as a speculator, he preferred meets and bounds. But when it came to being president of the United States and seeing what would best work for this new nation, which is yet to be proved, he allowed himself to be persuaded by Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton to go with the grid. And ultimately, his being persuaded went a long way toward seeing the grid as an important part of what ultimately happened. And so I think with that we can leave it there.
Wrap this up just to illustrate the point. In Ohio, in every map we've seen for 300 years back, both Miami rivers are on every map. Well, the Little Miami River in Greene County, we can walk on, and if you're on the west side of the Little Miami and look across the river, you're looking at the old world map. And behind you to the west, all the way to California, is the new world, the new way of measuring. So you can drive through Greene County in a TR3, which is not from the colonial era, and the roads are a hell of a lot of fun to drive on. But west of the Little Miami, the roads are straight as a shot, as if they fired a cannon and built the road behind the cannonball. And you can drive that, walk that, you are walking basically in the footsteps of Washington and his surveyors. I am an aviation photographer, and this snuck into the project. Happened to be a beautiful Waco taper wing, but it demonstrates the grid, which in Western Ohio, the grid that was formed. And so when you fly over the country and you fly into Denver and you look east, you see a grid as far as you can see. And when you fly into Portland, Oregon, and you fly over the mountains, the grid exists as far as you can see. And that's the point. George Washington was our collaborator in this book. He was looking over our shoulder, and actually George Washington was the photographer. The camera was Washington, the participants were his colleagues. And that, thank you very much for having us.
So we have our speakers. Thank you all for a fascinating series of talks that really demonstrate the manner in which mapping, surveying in particular, but by extension all mapping, is a process between the map makers and locals, which is always ready to bear in mind because we always think of maps as a snapshot of time, but they're generated over time and they get used over time, as we'll hear in the rest of this conference. I'm going to start off with a question for Ernie from Seth. It's a bit convoluted, but we'll get to it. As a theater historian and theorist, I'm interested in the ways in which performance studies often overlooks the historicity and the cultural specificity of scripts, which rarely resembles the model we might all carry in our minds. Lines and stage directions in an edition by, say, Samuel French. Even Western play scripts look profoundly different once we go only a little further back into the past. One way in which I might frame your talk, if I've understood correctly, is that indigenous Andeans viewed the land itself as a kind of script for communal life, and feared the creation of surveys that would in effect transform their script into a performer in the colonial script, the land becoming an entity made to perform in new ways. Does that sound right to you? And could you say more about how differing French and Andean understandings of what constitutes a script, indeed a performance, are implicated in the conflict you describe? I told you it was long.
Thank you for the question, Seth. Yes, I think you're understanding the relationship very well. In the way that I'm talking about a script in this paper, I'm using it as essentially a means to be able to like encounter, engage, and be within the environment a little bit more broadly. And whereas the survey, as I'm describing it, is something that operates as a script for transformation, in a way very similar to the last talk is describing with regards to George Washington. The ways in which indigenous Andeans conceived of their relationship with the natural environment was also particularly performative and based on a series of scripts in which different parts of the landscape took on not just meaning, but also essentially characters as places imbued with spirits of the ancestors and therefore of your kinship group, your family, and so forth. Encounters between different indigenous communities, if you're talking about, say, we'll take the expansion of the Incan Empire, for example, are seen, therefore, as clashes between different spirits as much as like tensions over control of specific parts of the landscape. So in that vein, what we're seeing is very much a way of thinking about the spiritual world being embodied within the physical world and the relations of the contemporary people to their past being enacted in a sort of everyday pageant, if you will, of social, political, and let's say religious identity. What happens with the colonial construction of space within its own gridded phenomenon, particularly, well, starting with the 16th century conquest, is a transformation of that relationship that is, however, rather incomplete. So whereas the Spanish Empire would have set up an idea of space and a different kind of performance of legitimacy and authority via a gridded mapped space, the connection to mountains or streams or other wakas continues on through to the present. And therefore, it's something that kind of exists in this contested, ongoing series of performances, one might say. And I think maybe I'll leave it there, which is itself kind of a convoluted answer, but to a very rich question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over another question to you, Ernie, because it's duplicative in some respects, but so my apologies to the questioner. For Clinton and Dan, I've got several questions from Jordana, who's in the room somewhere. I saw her sneak in. The question is twofold. So what inspired this method for research, and how, if at all, did this project emerge from and shape Terry's teaching? Teaching being a formative act, as we know.
Thank you for the question. The inspiration for this is really our fascination with the process and the tools they used and the conditions in which they had to work. And the ability to tell a story visually along with the text to make this an understandable process. But there is also a couple of guys who are fascinated with cool compasses and maps and the watercolors and the process of how it happened. Does that cover it? Yeah.
And from my perspective as a teacher, I have always been fascinated with how American historians ignored the importance of capitalism. Okay, we don't talk about it much. It is a constantly developing economic system, and our government and the way our nation has developed, we very much take for granted how much our government is invested in making capitalism work. Okay, it's a complicated system. It changed dramatically, for example, after 2010, okay, or 2008, 2009. And so all of this stuff, and so in my teaching, I am trying to bring capitalism back into the mix. And with regard to this particular project, it gets right to the heart of it, I think.
Well, I'm going to follow that up with another question from Seth, again to Clinton and Dan. Seth is very appreciative, as am I, of bringing capitalism back into at least the proto-capitalism of the 18th century. But what Seth is asking, what then do we know about the racial, class, religious, and ethnic backgrounds of the surveyors who interest you? We've learned over time how indispensable were indigenous and black collaborators to the mapping done by Lewis and Clark, for example, Misakajawea, most obviously. And I'm wondering whether you could say a bit more about the broader social world of early American surveyors.
Since this comes straight out of colonial England, the most important actors were, of course, the white males. Okay, we mentioned the interaction with the Native Americans, and the Native Americans understood when the surveyors showed up, permanent settlement followed. With regard to women helped the surveyors, but not the geographers. A surveyor would often show up, and a wife, a daughter, may very well be part of the crew that pulled chains and helped set boundaries. With regard to slaves and free African Americans in the North, individuals such as Benjamin Banneker were important but small in number. And African Americans, often servants and slaves, participated in the crews, but of course, being not supposed to be able to read and write, although a reasonable number of them could, they did not act as lead surveyors. I have no situation that I have found where a person of color other than Benjamin Banneker acted as a lead surveyor in any of our projects.
So I have a question for Imre, actually, and I'm wondering, because you covered a very large swath of time, and there's a change in mapping technologies, especially after diamonds are discovered. Is there a change in the role of the use of local labor from just labor to a more intellectual role to provide some of the detailed stuff to do all the detailed mapping in the right at the end of your period?
The bulk of the paper covers about 150 years, and there is in technology, obviously, an advancement. So you have stereo photogrammetry, as I showed you in 1917, 1918. But the involvement of the locals, you don't have a significant change. So it's a beginning. They were ignorant of what's going on, and by the 1910s around, they were keenly aware what is going on, try to resist on occasion, but participating beyond being chain carriers or carrying of equipment, providing venison for the surveying party. No, so it never came to academic engagement in the surveying.
Thank you. So I'm going back to the reenactment issue, because I'm getting several questions that point back to this issue of people other than white men engaged, and whether this would, if you were to recast, as it were, the performance now, how might you recast the people to reflect social structures at the time as opposed to now?
That's a pretty good question. The living historians we work with interpret the realities of the era they portrayed. And as Clint said, under the English system, that would have been white males. But their organization also is very adamant that their participants are well versed in the. If we were casting a movie, you bet, it would be a much more diverse story. Actually, in the film Last of the Mohicans, there is a scene where the farmers are in the wilderness and the entire family, the husband, the wife, the children are doing the farming. They would have done the surveying. That was a very interesting little tidbit in that movie that a lot of people overlook, the importance of the family on the frontier. And I think, yes, when we sell the movie rights to our book, we will certainly cast the roles in a different light.
The surveying as a profession at this particular time was highly respected, and it was reserved for those of a certain status. 4 of the 6 first Ohio governors, for example, had surveyed professionally at some point in their career. Okay, this is important. Almost 50% of the inventories of probate inventories of extensive landholders show that they owned surveying tools. And so this is not just a function of simply white males. It is, in some respects, white males of a certain class, a certain status in life, or on their way to earning a certain status in life.
Just to follow up on that, we discussed this and we felt we could not project 21st century that mentality on what happened in the 1750s. We wanted to be accurate. And so to be accurate, and these reenactors and living historians that we work with, we trusted their judgment. So we couldn't project what we think now is the right thing to do on the interpretation of the history from almost 300 years ago. So we're trying to adhere to the letter of what happened.
Ernie has a question.
So I guess my question's sort of building off of something that Imre was saying around the place of indigenous people in Southwest Africa being involved within the surveys as porters or other forms of laborers, and in essence being a part of the entire process of surveying, even if they're not the lead surveyors. And I guess the question that I have around thinking about this 18th century moment and about surveying as performance kind of more broadly is, how are we drawing the frame? If we widen the scope, at the beginning of the talk, Danny said something about taking a wide view and then getting close into a series of close-ups. But if we take the scope a little bit wider, away from just the individual doing the act of surveying themselves, the context would incorporate those indigenous communities that are being displaced. It would incorporate the servants and enslaved peoples. It would incorporate the families. And yet the photographs and the reenactment that's being done by the reenactors narrows the scope to only focus on the surveyor. In that way, what they're doing is repeating the 18th century mythology of the surveyor as acting alone, and therefore the legitimation of the white male British colonial subject operating on their own. So I guess the question would be, is there a way to think about the camera, I suppose, or more broadly, widening the angle, widening the frame, to be able to question that assumption of the uniqueness of the surveyor, as opposed to the surveyor within a broader matrix of social, political, economic change?
With regard to the private surveyor, that's certainly possible. But one of the things with the military organization is, of course, those were soldiers. And the vast majority of American soldiers were, in fact, white male. And so now, if we had a reenactment organization that did, for example, William Byrd's History of the Line, which is Virginia, North Carolina, the crew would have looked significantly different. It was not military. There would have been significant African-American participation, for example, as support personnel, not the lead surveyors. That's quite clear in Byrd's account, both of his accounts, that the lead surveyors were, in fact, white males. This was their purview. But the extensive, the rest of the crew would have been those whose position was to do as ordered.
So anyway, it's a great point, really, and in a broader view or more pages than we were allowed, that is certain, and we learned, we thought about this all during the process. And so, as I said before, we decided not to project 21st century attitudes onto the historical recording of the actions from 250 years ago.
I've got a couple of questions just came in, and we've only got 1 minute technically. And this is a big theme that both of these questions are raising. So I'm going to just read out the first one. The second one is very duplicative. These presentations make visible the violence that is hidden in or obscured by the map as a technology of representation, the circumstances under which surveying took place, and the way in which the maps were developed. What are we to do with these histories of colonial expansion, empire, and global extraction that are embedded in and made invisible by maps? Or would you say that these violent histories are actually encoded in maps? I don't know if anybody wants to respond. It just is the fact, says Dan. I'm getting nothing. It is because it is lunchtime and we're in dire need of coffee, more coffee and food. I would just like to especially thank that last point. And one of the things that Dan and Terry, Clinton and Dan said, thinking about mapping as performance in all aspects really does bring back the fact that history happened in color and in sound. And it's always, for me as an historian, that's what I want to get back to think in those terms. So thank you. We are joining, well, I'll let Jim say.
Yes, we'll count that as applause for all of our contributors to this morning's session. And for those of you who had sent questions, sorry we didn't have a lot of time in the end. I do think that this panel really did a great job of covering the gamut of both getting a sense of the performance, but also, I guess you'd say to some extent, the need to look beyond just the bodies immediately and look at the broader implications, and to really get a good sense of the wider implications of this work, as well as the physicality of this work, which I think really came through. Thank you all again, and thank you for coming. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.